to Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which features interviews and discussions on all issues relating to high quality in the early years and school-age care sector. In our episodes, we have a range of speakers who are leaders in the areas that matter to Early Childhood Ireland members. This podcast series is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance, which offers a comprehensive range of cover at discounted premiums for both business and personal insurance. So do pop over and visit www.aricus.ie for more information. I'm Maura Corbett and I work with Early Childhood Ireland. In Early Childhood Ireland, we're very aware of the diversity and range of languages spoken in Ireland and how this impacts on settings. Ireland, as you know, has long had two official languages, and with the addition of ISL, Irish Sign Language, we now have actually three official languages, but the number of languages being used in Ireland now is huge. As a result, children and educators in settings in many cases speak or are exposed to many languages, which makes for a really rich, diverse experience. But sometimes tapping into that and harnessing it can pose some challenges. And today I'm really glad to be joined by my colleague, Dr Christina Egan Marnell. Christina is an early childhood specialist at Early Childhood Ireland. She's a qualified early childhood teacher. She completed a BA in early childhood care and education at the Sligo IT. And more recently, she gained her doctorate of education at Victoria University in Wellington. She's a passionate advocate for the power of play-based learning and the vital role of early childhood education in society. She sees herself as a lifelong learner, with every interaction providing a new perspective. Christina, you're really welcome.
Thanks, Maura. I'm delighted to be able to join you and share a little bit about my experience, but also hopefully learn something from you as well as our discussion into multilingualism.
Well, I'm really looking forward to hearing about your experiences and insights, and I suppose the perspective of New Zealand, which we hear a lot about sometimes, but to hear, kind of specific experiences will be great. But I suppose before we head to New Zealand, I might start by asking you why you personally feel it's important to recognise and value all the languages that children experience and speak, why that's so important.
I think, particularly when we consider the Irish context and what happens within Ireland, we have so many more other language speakers now that are part of our society and really add to the rich diversity that makes our society so unique. So there's over 750,000 people who speak a language other than English or Irish in their homes in Ireland. That's over 15% of our population. And this suggests that children across early years and school-age childcare services in Ireland are also speaking a whole range of other languages. For our educators and teachers within the early years sector, we have a really important role to play in educating our families and working alongside them to help them to understand the benefits of bilingualism and multilingualism. Because the languages that children hear and that they speak is really important. That sense of identity and sense of belonging is so keenly attached to children's experiences of their home languages, but also of the dominant language in the culture that they're in. The languages that we have in our earlier settings can be celebrated both orally and in the written form as well. And there's so many opportunities to go about celebrating those languages in a very straightforward way. It doesn't have to be complex. We're really aware of how busy everyone's day is, especially in our earlier settings. So we want to talk about ways that this can be fun, that both educators, children and their families can really enjoy it.
And I suppose that you can show value in simple ways. It doesn't have to be, like you say, awfully complex, but the children get that sense that the language they speak at home is very valuable, and the language that their languages, even that their parents may speak. I remember a former colleague of ours, Maya Hals-Brosnan, talking about in a previous blog about her oldest child hadn't made her school aware that she spoke Danish at home, because and the teacher wasn't disinterested. Her little girl wasn't sure if this was something that was cool, maybe even or not. And she was an older child, but we can give children that sense that it is cool to have other languages in quite simple ways without adding to the busyness of the day. We talk as well about children with additional languages. Of course, we must remember that we have staff with additional languages too, and I'm sure you'll thread that experience through our conversation today. So could we maybe, we hear a lot about Te Whare and the links between Ashler and Te Whare, but could you take us through some of your experience in New Zealand, in practice, in settings, and differences and similarities between Te Whare and Ashler, and giving us some insight into that experience?
Absolutely. I think one of the key similarities between the two curriculums is that they're representing their countries that have many languages. So similar to the Irish context within New Zealand, they have 3 official languages, which is English, Te Reo Māori, and New Zealand Sign Language. And as official languages, there is an expectation that they will be interwoven through the education system, which also includes early years. But separate to that, New Zealand is an exceptionally diverse country with different ethnicities and cultures. They have over 200 different languages that are spoken on a very regular basis. And that's reflective of the children and their families who attend earlier services and the ways that they communicate. I think a great similarity between the two curriculum frameworks is their commitment to children's well-being and to a sense of belonging and identity. And they're very much connected in the frameworks themselves, show the connection between children's languages and identities being celebrated, and how we have opportunities to do that in lots of different ways. I think the differences that we can see between the two are that New Zealand have had a bit more of an opportunity with their curriculum framework to test out how some of the different areas work, and they have had their second revision, whereas for the Irish context, Ashler is just being revised now for the first time. So we'll have an opportunity to change what that looks like for the children in our services, but also to take advantage of the lessons other countries have learned and apply that, and how we can make quality experiences for children the norm in the early years.
We can say families, but within that there's so much variety. There are families who speak multiple languages and really fluent English. And then there are families who speak another language at home and whose English isn't great. We mightn't speak all the home languages, we probably don't. We might have staff who do. So I think there's a lot to kind of unpick in terms of your practical experience on, how we can support families to value their multiple languages, their heritage languages. And then, have you ideas from your experience on how to support families who don't speak much English? We mightn't speak their home language, but how we can encourage them, I suppose convey to them the value that we have on their home language.
I think, yeah. And I think that's a really important point to make, is that the availability of languages and people's different levels of competencies in different languages, whether that's families or educators, is really diverse. So there is no one-size-fits-all approach. I think the key to celebrating these languages and finding ways to bring them into our practice is starting off by recognizing them and acknowledging them. That's the most important thing. If as a non-English speaker, or perhaps as English as a second language, if you hear or see someone acknowledging in your home language in any shape or form, that makes a huge difference to you, to your sense of well-being, to your feeling of being accepted into your new community, becoming engaged with the wider society. That level of acknowledgement makes a huge difference. And I think it's important for people to recognize that there's no requirement for you to be fluent in any language. If your first language is English, that's great. You don't have to be fluent in many other languages, but you do need to make an attempt and to acknowledge it. From my personal experience being overseas, and having someone make an attempt to say Gia ditch to you in Irish, even if the pronunciation was terrible, it made you feel connected. It made you feel recognized, and it felt like, oh, someone is interested in my culture, someone is interested in my language, and they want to engage with me. They want to find out more. And I think that's the same approach that we can take when we're working with families and parents who have varying levels of English, is that initial recognition of you speak another language. And that's a great thing. Not that it's a negative thing, that's a really great thing. There's so much research that tells us now that children learning 2, 3 or more languages at a young age does not impede their ability to learn English or to learn those other languages. It actually strengthens their skills because their brain works in a very different way to the way that we assume that it's going to work and learn in different languages. So the ways that we can get involved and support that is really important. For educators in particular, I think the key to supporting and promoting many different languages is integrating them into your everyday activities. So rather than say, okay, well, between 11 and 11:30 today at circle time, we're going to focus on the Polish language. Not creating a special time in the day to do it, rather integrate them into the everyday activities with children. We all have our own opinions on the ways that we might have learned Irish in our primary and secondary school experiences. And a lot of us will say we didn't particularly enjoy it. The way that it was taught, the way that it was shared may not have been the most engaging way for many of us. But we know that integrating and using other languages in an early years environment can be done through play. So that makes it a fun and engaging experience where they have a positive interaction with it.
I suppose as well, it's an ideal opportunity to, and I'm using air quotes here, make use of staff who have different languages as their native language, that it's a good opportunity to, even if they're not working in that room, that they can help share some of those ideas with parents and, get into deeper conversations with parents. So Christina, you've mentioned about, even in your experience, somebody saying to you showed that they valued your Irish language, and our experience of learning Irish mightn't have left us very fluent. I suppose to go back to the early years, if you've parents who, they've moved somewhere new, they want their children to settle in, become part of the community. And they may believe that the way to do this is to totally immerse their children in English and maybe forget about their home language. And you don't speak their language. So, have you experience of how you can, help parents to understand that their language is really important, and how, you mentioned that point that, research has shown now that it isn't a drawback to speak other languages. In fact, it strengthens your ability to speak other languages. So can you take us through some kind of practical ideas from your experience and how we can work with parents who may not have very fluent English?
Absolutely. I have had experiences where I have had families, when they've enrolled their child, they have the name that was written on the enrollment form struck me as a very English sounding name, but I knew that these families were not from an English speaking country. So I had asked, does your child have additional names? And they would say, yes, they do. And we think that they should just have an English name now that they're here, because we want them to just speak English. We want them to be absorbed into an English speaking culture, into a Western culture even. And for me, in that experience, I felt very emotional on behalf of the family and the child, because they were clearly going through a transition into a new country, into a new way, and they had their child's well-being at the top of their mind. They thought this was the best approach to take, and perhaps they were given advice on that. And when I had the opportunity to speak to educators who were from a similar culture, and I asked them about their understanding, they said that they were often advised this is the best thing that they can do for their children. So it was going back to basics with the family and building up a relationship, building up a sense of trust with them, and explaining to them that we would very much like to use whatever name they preferred. We would respect their choice. However, if they would like to use their child's name from their home culture, we would really like to use it too. Would they teach us how to pronounce it correctly so that we could make sure we were always pronouncing it correctly? Any parent can tell you the battle they go through in trying to choose a name for their child, and how every single name has incredible meaning to it. And that's the same for any child that's with us in our early year services. There's a huge meaning attached to their name. So we want to respect that and use their name where the parents want us to do so. Over time, I found that these families, when they could see that we were genuinely interested in promoting their home language, they would encourage us then to use their child's first given name from their home culture. The other thing that we would often see with families who maybe didn't speak English very well is that they really wanted to participate in their child's learning and development. And we could see that from very early on, but there was a language barrier to them. They didn't know how to engage with us. Sometimes I would work with grandparents and they would do a lot of the drop off and pick up of children, and there could often be a language barrier there, and trying to share that information could be challenging. So sometimes we would see if there was older children or other family members in the family who maybe have a stronger command of the English language, and we would invite them to be part of discussions and help with translating. We also recognise that over time, both the families and the children would learn more in the English language and the communication skills would develop. And sometimes it was about having more patience and allowing that to happen before we could get into more deeper conversations around learning and development for the children. Sometimes it was finding ways to provide them written information in their home language. If it was things around the curriculum that often came from government sources, they would already have translations available that we could download, print, send by email, which could really help. If we had other family members or other staff members who were bilingual, who spoke that language and also spoke English, they could sometimes help us in translating some basic things into the written language so that they had an opportunity to take it home with them, sit down and to read it at their own pace and think about some questions that they might want to ask. Some other things that I learned along the way was about our specialised language. So every profession has their own terms that they use as part of their specialised language. In early years, we talk a lot about play-based learning. We talk about the different programs that we have. We talk about ECE, ECCE, ECEC. These are things that are second nature to all of us, but they are not to parents, whether their first language is English or otherwise. So thinking about the conversation you want to have with that particular family before they arrive and asking yourself, is this plain, common, more familiar words that I'm using, or am I using some of our sector's specialised language? That would be just add to the confusion in that conversation with them. ASHTR's guidelines for good practice has a really good section on this. And so I definitely encourage everyone to have a look at that. And they recommend things like writing notes alongside talking to the families, but also using pictures and finding ways that you can communicate with parents the basic information that you want to at pick up and drop off time, until you find other ways that you can have more complex information to share with them. Most parents and families will also be trying to do a series of strategies themselves to communicate back with you. And I think once you can share that with them, that you want to communicate and understand that they're trying to communicate back with you, you can often find a shared way that you're going to make that happen.
I suppose technology can be very useful now, once you accept, I suppose, that sometimes things can get lost in translation, and sometimes you can get a sense that the answer you're getting isn't quite the question that you meant to ask.
Yes.
But it could be because of that kind of specialised language that the translation app doesn't understand maybe a term that you used. But when you tune in, you get a sense that I remember being in radio a number of years ago and a couple of times feeling that the answer we got to a question we had asked wasn't quite the question that the translator had maybe heard and translated into Italian. But they're really useful strategies there that can help. Christina, you've had some involvement with our OWL project, but I think we're currently engaged in a continuation of that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we have another exciting project that's actually called Owlet. And Owlet is specifically focusing on the 1 to 2 year olds, our younger infants, because we know that infants are not always included in research or in projects, but that they have a voice and that they have just as much to offer with their contribution as any other child. This project is looking at multilingualism as well, and particularly looking at diversity and how children build a sense of identity and a sense of belonging in their earlier service. So the Owlet project is looking at different languages. Really exciting. We have 10 different singers who are singing lullabies from their home culture in their home language. And these languages are from across the world, and we're so excited about the diversity that they offer. And the idea is that the lullabies will be played in the service so that children get to experience hearing their home language outside of their home, and that they get to experience those familiar sounds and words that they're used to, and hearing them in the environment with their educators who are celebrating them as well. The lullaby recordings will also be shared alongside a lullaby book, which will be illustrated and designed specifically towards our infant age group. And accompanying both of those will be an e-resource specifically designed for educators in how they can promote multilingualism with infants and use these lullabies in different ways in their practice. Each of the singers that we have spoken to have been really excited about this project because each of them recognises having their language celebrated with young children can have such an impact in celebrating not just their culture, but that children see other really important caregivers in their life wanting to engage with them with their home culture.
Sounds good. There's something about lullabies, isn't there, that's so kind of comforting and homely, and I think it even brings us back to our own childhood.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be a lovely resource, and looking forward to kind of hearing more about it as time goes on. Christina, I suppose we've spoken a good bit about oral language and communicating orally with families, and you made mention, all right, of maybe writing stuff down for parents or using already translated documents from Tefariki or Ashter or whatever. Have you other ideas on using the written language and supporting and valuing written language from families?
I think when we think about languages, we often automatically think about the oral expression of language, but the written expression of language is just as important. And because our early year services are such a visual environment with the resources that we have available, but the physical environment as well, there's lots of opportunities to show the written language there. One of the things that I have always found really helpful is when a child enrolls in a service, that the enrollment form has a question that asks, what is your home language? And languages, plural if there's many of them. And that this information then is shared with any of the educators who's going to be caring for and educating that child, so that everyone knows from the beginning there is additional languages that this family speaks, and it would be fantastic for us to know that from the beginning. With that, it's about learning the correct spelling of the child's name. So in the way that in the Irish language we use a fada over certain letters, and that changes the pronunciation, other languages have special characters as well that they use, and they change the pronunciation of it. So it's taking that maybe from the enrolment form, how does the family spell the child's name, and making sure that that correct spelling then is used when you have labels above baskets, when they have a locker or a hook to put their bag and their name is displayed over that. Even if you're writing their name on folders or artwork, that it's the correct spelling that's been used, so that we're making sure we're identifying this is how this child's name is spelt. Because quite likely the next thing you'll say to the parent is, and can you teach me how to pronounce that correctly? So that we're celebrating it right from the get-go. If you have a key group of children, it's a really good idea to write a list of each child, their ethnicity, and the languages that they have at home. And then you can create something like a world map display that goes up on the walls in your classroom. So for example, you might have a picture of a child, Diego, in your class, and he's going to sit beside the country of Spain. And from that, you might have a little note that says Diego also speaks Spanish. So you start to build up a picture of your classroom identity, not just of the individual child. Something else that I found really useful was doing an audit of the books that you have available for the children. So that basket or shelf of storybooks that's available for children, have a look and see, is every book in here in English only? Is there other languages that could be included? You can even ask parents, have you got storybooks that you guys might be finished with at home? We would love to have books that contain your language and include them as part of the resources. And that's not saying there's an expectation for educators to be able to read those books fluently, but it is important that there is other languages because they could be written in a different way. We don't all follow the English alphabet. There can be languages written in Arabic and in Chinese that use a very different type of format. And it's important for children to see that represented in their environment as well. You could find by having those books available, if parents and families have time to spend a little bit of time in the classroom with the children, that they might be encouraged to pick up that book and read it, not just to their child, but to the wider group that's there. And that can again be another non-complicated way that we can promote another language in the classroom with children. If you have lots of great displays around your walls and your windows, and particularly as we change from Halloween into a Christmas season, these displays can be absolutely gorgeous that appear in our classrooms. But think about, are they all in English? Is there an opportunity to include something else in our displays with different written languages? You could have, when you enter the door to the service or to into the classroom, you might have a welcome poster that has good morning or welcome or hello in the different languages of the children that's in your classroom, so that it's visually represented not just to the child, but also to the parent as well when they come in. And another one that I used to personally use myself was in any type of pedagogical documentation, in particular learning stories. I would often start the learning story by saying hello to the child, hello to their family in their home language. And I used Google Translate for that every time. And it just set the tone of the story from the beginning of saying, hi, I recognize that you have a different language and I really want to incorporate that into your child's learning. So you can bring in different strategies to represent and celebrate the written language in your classroom space as well.
I love the idea of the map as well, that can help parents even see that maybe they're not the only family from a particular country or speaking a particular language. And I suppose it can help us too to avoid that situation. I think I mentioned it in a previous podcast where a setting I heard of knew a child spoke Spanish at home, so assumed the child was from Spain, but in fact the child was from South America. But those assumptions we make that Spanish equals Spain, and that's not always the case. And we touched a couple of times on staff speaking different languages. Have you anything more specific to say in terms of, I suppose, kind of harnessing that and capturing that in terms of deepening the relationships with parents?
I think educators can be one of the greatest and richest sources of knowledge as part of our early year services and part of our teams. They are often bilingual or multilingual, and they have a really strong comprehension of other languages. And they more often than not really want to share that knowledge with families and with their colleagues to really enhance the experiences for children. So if, for example, we had an educator who may be from Germany, the fact that they could use their German language during the day has a big impact on lots of people. One, the child that's near them, that hears their home language being spoken, and then families that enter the room and hear their home languages being spoken feel like, okay, I have another connection to this place. I have another reason why I can build a stronger sense of belonging and identity in this group, but also that they can help other staff members to understand what it's like to be part of another linguistic and cultural community. Because it can be challenging if we haven't had that experience before to understand what that might feel like for children. So staff members who can speak other languages can be a great resource in helping us to understand what children might feel, and then in turn develop some strategies that can help them feel more at ease. They can also be a fantastic way to develop communication pathways with families who may not speak English well, or who may not be sure of how they can communicate. They can help to facilitate that partnership and that pathway until perhaps families learn more English. Maybe we as educators learn more of their home language, but they can be that connection at the beginning to help us to share that important information. I know that some services, when they're aware that children speak a particular home language, and if they have an educator that speaks that same home language, they can pair them up as part of their key group to really help the transition into the service and to help them settle in with more ease. Because if we can take away that fear of not being able to communicate, it can really alleviate a lot of concerns for everybody. So there's such a rich resource that they can offer to everyone. And it's definitely worth having a conversation about how else they think they can share through their language ways to support multilingualism.
And I suppose it's a great resource to have too, if you need to have maybe a trickier conversation with families about maybe additional needs or whatever. So, you know, other parents who speak English better than a particular another family, that's great in terms of, you know, we're having a Halloween fair on whatever day, but there can be conversations that are more confidential, and tapping into staff who might speak that language is a great resource to have.
The only last thing, or I guess my final message that I would share with early years educators is, don't be afraid of getting your pronunciation wrong. Any attempt that you make is a really valid attempt. And while you might be afraid, I'm not confident, I don't know if I've got the pronunciation right, I may not just say it because of it. It is always worth making the attempt. And even if you get the pronunciation wrong, you'll learn. Parents can give you the correct pronunciation. I'm sure the children themselves can give us the correct pronunciation. It is always worth it to try it, because it will have an impact on those children that are hearing you and hearing you celebrate their home language.
That's a great message to end on. So I suppose, Christina, thank you. All I can do is thank you for sharing those insights, those kind of practical ideas on, particularly with parents who don't speak English. I often think we're really, you know, when we go abroad, even in Europe, we're so spoiled in some ways, in that we don't have to make the same effort to learn other languages as people from other languages do. And I think being patient and understanding and developing that understanding of what a gift it is, and the richness that it brings, and conveying that to parents who may feel that their English isn't good enough. And again, I'm doing the air quotes thing there. So I think those practical ideas about being patient and recognizing that parents will be making their own efforts and coming up with their own ideas is really good. So Christina, thanks very much for sharing all of that with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Maura. It was, I think as educators, hearing different examples from practice, whether that's from me or whether that's from their colleagues or other people in their wider community, has so many valuable strategies to share. I think we often don't have to reinvent the wheel. A lot of these strategies have been tried out by our colleagues, and it's about sharing these ideas together to make things easier for all of us, because we all have the same vision. We all want children to have quality experiences in our early years services and in early years services across the country, and that can happen through the benefit of multilingualism. And and bilingualism. And I think we all have so many ideas that we can share together. So it's finding opportunities to do that.
Thanks again, Christina. And thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which is proudly supported by Arcus Insurance. And if you enjoyed it, please subscribe and spread the word to your friends and colleagues. And please stay tuned for our next episode.